horse stopped at the gate and would not go any farther, and that was the first strange thing about the morning Sue Lynn Reed rode onto Ezra Colton's land. No one had crossed that gate in 6 years. The people of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, said so the way they said the creek ran cold in August, as a fact too old to argue with. Ezra Colton had built the fence higher than any fence needed to be, and he had not shaken a hand or shared a meal at another man's table since the summer of 1868. Some said grief had done it. Some said pride. Nobody said it to his face, because nobody got close enough to say anything to his face at all. But on this morning in July of 1874, a woman in a dark blue traveling dress sat straight-backed on a horse the color of scorched coffee, and the horse would not pass the gate-post, no matter how she urged it, because the horse remembered the man who lived beyond it, and the man who lived beyond it had not seen that horse in 3 years, and did not yet know it was the reason his whole world was about to turn over. Ezra heard the horse before he saw the rider. He knew the sound of that particular gate the way another man might know his own mother's voice, a familiar unevenness in the left front step that came from an old injury nobody had ever fully doctored out of the animal. He set down the fence post he was tamping and walked toward the gate with his jaw already tight, because there was only one horse in the territory that walked like that, and he had given it away himself, with his own hands, on the happiest day of Nathaniel Reed's life. He had not seen Nathaniel Reed in 3 years either. Nathaniel had married a woman named Sue Lynn, a widow who had come west from San Francisco with her first husband and stayed on after burying him, and the two of them had built a small horse ranch 2 counties over, and Ezra had told himself he was glad for his oldest friend, even as he stopped writing letters, stopped visiting, stopped doing much of anything but working his own land alone until the work became the whole shape of his life. Now the horse stood at his gate, and the widow sat on its back, and something in Ezra's chest went cold and still before she said a single word. "Mr. Colton," she said. Her voice was even, careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed a sentence and was choosing to deliver it plainly rather than let it come apart in her mouth. "I have brought Copper home." Ezra did not move for a long moment. The horse, Copper, tossed its head and stamped once, and the sound of the hoof against the dry summer ground seemed too loud in the quiet. "Where is Nathaniel?" Ezra said, though some cold animal part of him already knew the answer from the black at her collar and the flatness behind her eyes. "There was an accident," Sue Lynn said, 6 weeks ago. A wagon and a washed-out grade above the river crossing. He did not suffer long." Ezra felt the words land somewhere below his ribs, a blow that did not announce itself with pain so much as with the sudden absence of air. He put a hand on the top rail of the gate he had built too high, the gate nobody had crossed in 6 years, and for a moment he was not a rancher standing on his own land, but a boy again, 17 years old, laughing with Nathaniel Reed over a shared canteen on a cattle drive neither of them had been old enough to be part of. "I am sorry," Sue Lynn said, and there was nothing performed in it. "I know what he was to you. He spoke of you often. He said you were the only man in the territory who never once asked him to explain himself." Ezra looked at her properly then, for the first time since the horse had stopped at the gate. She could not have been older than 30, with dark hair pulled back plain and practical, hands that showed the calluses of someone who worked animals for a living rather than someone who merely rode them for pleasure. There was no softness bidding for his sympathy in her face. There was only the flat, held-together look of a woman who had done a great deal of grieving already and had more of it waiting for her at home, wherever home was now. "Why did you bring him here?" Ezra said, and he did not mean it unkindly, only plainly, because he could not make sense of the last 3 minutes of his life. "Because he was Nathaniel's gift from you," Sue Lynn said. and because I cannot keep him." Something in that second half of the sentence caught, and Ezra heard it the way a man who has lived alone long enough hears every small thing that does not sit flush. "Cannot," he repeated, "or will not." Sue Lynn's mouth tightened, the first crack in the composure she had ridden 2 counties to maintain. "There is a man named Wallace Pruitt who holds the note on our ranch," she said. "Nathaniel borrowed against the land 2 winters ago to buy breeding stock, and he had not finished paying it back when he died. Mr. Pruitt says the note comes due in full within the month, on account of Nathaniel's passing, and he says I am not the party the note was made with, and he says a woman cannot hold a debt instrument in her own name in this territory, regardless of what any lawyer might tell her." "That is not entirely true," Ezra said slowly. "Widows have more claim to their own affairs than married women do. Any circuit judge would tell him so." "Mr. Pruitt does not intend for this to reach a circuit judge," Sue Lynn said. "He intends for it to be settled before one is ever within 100 miles of Larkspur Hollow. He has already sent 2 men to look over the horses. I sold 3 head to pay what I could, and I am here because Copper was worth more to Nathaniel than any of the others, and I did not want him standing in Wallace Pruitt's corral when the rest of it is taken." Ezra stood with his hand still on the gate rail, and the summer heat pressed down on the back of his neck, and he understood, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes lends a man before the grief itself fully arrives, that his 6 years of silence and high fences were about to end, whether he wanted them to or not. "Get down," he said. "Water your horse. We'll talk on the porch." Sue Lynn hesitated, and he saw her weigh the offer the way a person weighs an offer from a stranger in a place where strangers had cost her something before. Then she swung down from the saddle with the easy competence of someone who had spent a life around horses, and led Copper through the gate that had not opened for 6 years, and Ezra Colton felt the old hinges groan like something waking up. They sat on the porch, with 2 cups of well water because Ezra kept no coffee in the house that summer, having let the habit lapse along with most other habits of company. Sue Lynn told him the rest of it in pieces, not because she was withholding, but because grief made a person's account of things come out sideways, in fragments that had to be turned right side up before they made sense. Wallace Pruitt owned the largest spread in 3 counties, and the only bank within a 2-day ride, and he had built both from a talent for finding men in trouble and offering them rope that turned out, once a man had climbed part way up it, to be more noose than lifeline. Nathaniel Reed had gone to him for a loan against future foals, a common enough arrangement, but the terms had been written by a man who understood exactly how much could be squeezed from a hopeful borrower who did not read every line as closely as he should have. "He came to the ranch himself 3 days after the funeral," Sue Lynn said, staring at the water in her cup rather than at Ezra. "He wore his good hat and spoke very gently and told me he was sorry for my loss. Then he told me the note was due, and that a widow with no sons and no standing before the county recorder was not a party he was obligated to negotiate with. He offered to buy the land outright, less than 1/3 of what it is worth, and if you refuse, then he will call the note in 30 days, and I will lose the land regardless, and he will have paid nothing for it at all." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that had gone past crying into a kind of hard, exhausted clarity. "I did not come here to ask you for money, Mr. Colton. I know you do not have men like Wallace Pruitt's kind of money, and I would not ask it of you if you did. I came because Copper deserved better than his corral, and because Nathaniel would have wanted him with you." Ezra turned the tin cup in his hands and looked out over the dry summer grass toward the mountains that stood the same blue distance they had stood at every day for 6 years. And he thought about the boy he had been at 17, and the man Nathaniel Reed had grown into, steady and generous and entirely too trusting of men who wore good hats and spoke gently. "I am not letting Wallace Pruitt take that land," Ezra said. "You do not know him," Su Lin said. "He is patient. He is polite. That is what makes him dangerous. He has never once raised his voice at anyone in this territory, and he has taken 4 ranches in the last 5 years without ever needing to." "I know enough," Ezra said. "I know a man who writes a note designed to be broken is not a man interested in being repaid. He is interested in the land." Su Lin studied him for a long moment, as though recalculating something. "What would you have me do?" "Stay the night," Ezra said. "Tomorrow we ride to your ranch, and we look at that note together, line by line, and we find out exactly what Wallace Pruitt is standing on." She did not answer right away, and Ezra understood the hesitation was not about the plan, but about him, about the gate that had stood shut for 6 years, and the man who had shut it, and whether a woman who had already buried one husband to a bad decision could trust a second man's sudden willingness to involve himself in her troubles. "I am not asking anything of you beyond the reading of a document," Ezra said, reading the hesitation correctly. "You have lost enough without owing debts of gratitude on top of it." Something in her shoulders eased, fractionally. "Then I accept your help reading a document," she said, and for the first time since she had come through the gate, there was the faint suggestion of dry humor in it, the kind of humor a person could only manage when they were exhausted past the point of formality. She stayed in the small room that had belonged to Ezra's mother before the fever took her, a room that had not been slept in for 6 years and smelled of dust and cedar when Ezra aired it out that evening. He fed Copper in the barn and stood for a long while with his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the old scar under the coat where a barbed wire fence had caught him as a colt, remembering the day he had handed the lead rope to Nathaniel and watched his friend's face do something Ezra had never forgotten, a kind of unguarded joy that men on the frontier rarely let themselves show. He did not sleep well that night. Grief has a way of arriving late, after the practical matters have been handled, and it arrived for Ezra somewhere past midnight, a slow, crushing weight that had nothing to do with wagons or grades or river crossings, and everything to do with the specific silence of a friend who would never again ride up to that gate calling out some fool joke before he had even dismounted. Ezra lay in the dark and let it move through him the way weather moves through a valley, and by morning he had folded it down into something he could carry without it showing on his face, because there was a woman down the hall who needed him steady, not broken. They rode out at first light. The distance to the Reed Ranch was a full day in the saddle, and they spoke little of it, both of them occupied with the particular concentration long riding demands. But what conversation there was told Ezra things he had not expected. Su Lin had grown up the daughter of a merchant in San Francisco, and had married her first husband, a man 20 years her senior, in an arrangement her family had brokered when she was young. He had died of consumption within 4 years, leaving her a modest independence and a hard education in what it meant to be a woman with property, and no man standing beside her to make the world take her seriously. She had met Nathaniel Reed at a stock auction, of all unlikely places, where he had been the only buyer in the yard who addressed his questions to her directly, instead of to whichever male relative happened to be standing nearby. "He listened," she said, somewhere in the long afternoon, when the horses had settled into the rhythm of the trail, and the silence between them had grown easy enough to break without ceremony. "That was the whole of it, in the beginning. He listened, and he did not seem to find it strange that I had opinions about bloodlines and pasture rotation. Most men found that strange." "Nathaniel never had much use for what most men found strange," Ezra said. "He married you and never once mentioned it needed explaining. Not in any letter he sent me." "He wrote to you about me?" "He wrote to me about you a great deal, in the early years," Ezra admitted, and something in his own voice surprised him, a rawness he had not intended to let through. "I stopped answering his letters somewhere along the way. That was my failing, not his. I told myself I was too busy with the ranch. The truth is, I did not know how to watch a friend build the kind of life I had decided was not for me, without it costing me something I did not want to look at too closely." Sue Lynn did not press him on what that something might have been, and Ezra was grateful for it, and they rode the rest of the afternoon in a silence that had shifted from careful to something closer to companionable. They reached the Reed Ranch as the light was going gold and long across the pasture, and Ezra felt the specific ache of a place built by a friend's hands. A modest clapboard house and a well-kept barn and fences that showed the particular attention of a man who had believed he was building something permanent. Two ranch hands, older men who had worked for Nathaniel since before his marriage, came out to greet him, and their faces told Ezra everything about how thin the household's hopes had worn in the 6 weeks since the accident. The note itself was kept in a strong box in the small office off the kitchen, and Ezra spread it across the table that night by lamplight and read it 3 times before he said anything at all. "There," he said finally, tapping a clause near the bottom of the second page. "Here's what he's standing on. This clause says the note transfers to the estate upon the borrower's death and becomes payable in full within 30 days, unless the estate can show, and I am reading this exact, unless the estate can show clear title through direct male inheritance or a co-signing party of record." "That is what he told me," Sue Lynn said, "that because I am not named as a co-signer, I have no standing." "But you were his wife," Ezra said. "Under territorial law, a widow inherits her husband's estate outright, unless a will states otherwise. Debts included, obligations included, and standing included. This clause is written to sound like it overrides that law. It does not. It cannot. A private note cannot supersede territorial statute, and Wallace Pruitt knows that better than anyone in this room, because he has a lawyer on retainer who wrote this clause specifically to frighten grieving widows who have never had cause to read territorial inheritance statute themselves." Sue Lynn sat very still, her hands folded on the table, and for the first time since she had ridden up to Ezra's gate, something like anger showed plainly on her face, clean and hot and entirely justified. "He counted on me not knowing," she said. "He counted on you not knowing, and he counted on you having no one to ask," Ezra said. "That is his whole method. He does not need to break the law when he can simply convince people the law is not on their side." "Then we go to the county recorder," Sue Lynn said. "We show him the statute." "We do," Ezra said, "but Wallace Pruitt is not a man who loses gracefully, and he will not simply accept a piece of paper telling him his clever clause does not hold water. We should expect him to make this difficult before it is finished." He was not wrong. Wallace Pruitt made it difficult within 2 days. Ezra and Sue Lynn rode into the town of Larkspur Hollow on the 3rd morning, the note and a hastily gathered set of witness statements from Nathaniel's ranch hands folded carefully into Ezra's saddlebag, intending to lay the matter before the county recorder before Pruitt could maneuver further. But Pruitt had eyes in every direction in that town, the way men who own the only bank for 2 days' ride tend to, and he was waiting on the steps of the recorder's office when they arrived, flanked by 2 men whose job, plainly, was not clerical. "Mrs. Reed," Pruitt said, tipping his good hat, his voice pitched for the small gathering of townsfolk who had already begun to notice the tension in the street, "and Mr. Colton, I confess I did not expect to see you involved in this matter. I had heard you kept mostly to yourself these days." "I keep to myself when there is nothing worth leaving my land for," Ezra said. This qualified. "I only want what is owed to me," Pruitt said, and his voice never rose, never sharpened, remained pleasant and reasonable in a way that Ezra now understood, watching it in person, to be exactly the kind of danger Sue Lynn had described. "A debt is a debt, gentlemen and lady, whatever grief has befallen the household. I would be failing my own obligations to the bank's depositors if I simply forgave what is owed because the timing proved unfortunate." "The timing is not the issue," Ezra said, and he pulled the folded note from his saddlebag and held it up where the gathering crowd could see the paper, if not read it. "The issue is that this clause you have relied upon does not override territorial inheritance statute, and you know it does not. And I intend to lay that fact before the recorder this morning with witnesses present." Something shifted, briefly, behind Pruitt's composed face. A flicker gone almost as fast as it arrived, but Ezra saw it and understood he had landed a blow that mattered. "You are a rancher, Mr. Colton, not a lawyer," Pruitt said, still pleasant, still measured. "I would be careful about the confidence with which you interpret documents outside your expertise." "I do not need to be a lawyer to read what is plainly written," Ezra said, "and I do not need your permission to bring this before a man who is paid by this county to settle exactly this sort of dispute." The crowd on the street had grown, the way crowds do in small towns when the promise of a real confrontation hangs in the air, and Ezra felt the weight of all those watching eyes settle on the moment, and he understood, with the particular sharpness grief and anger together can lend a man, that this was the instant Sue Lynn's whole future would turn on, one way or another. But it was Sue Lynn herself who spoke next, and her voice, when it came, was not raised, was not pleading, was simply and entirely certain. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "you told me in my own kitchen that I had no standing because I am a widow with no sons. You said it as though it were a settled fact, rather than a claim you invented to frighten a grieving woman before she had time to learn better. I have since learned better. Territorial statute is clear, and I have it here in my own hand, and I intend to read it aloud on these steps in front of every person present, so that no other widow in this county need be frightened by the same lie you told me." She drew the folded statute from her own satchel, a copy Ezra had helped her obtain from a lawyer's clerk in the county seat 2 days prior, and she began to read it aloud, plainly, without theater, letting the words themselves do the work. The crowd went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it is witnessing something true being spoken against something false, and Ezra watched Wallace Pruitt's composed face hold its pleasant shape even as the color went thin beneath it, because a reputation built on quiet, polite predation cannot survive being read aloud on public steps. Pruitt did not concede the note that morning. Men like him rarely concede anything in the moment they are first caught out. But he left the steps of the recorder's office with his 2 men and did not press the matter further in front of the gathered town. And Ezra understood that the true fight, the one that would decide whether Sue Lynn kept her land, had not ended, only begun. It ended 11 days later in a manner that owed nothing to luck. Pruitt tried one further maneuver, a claim filed with a traveling territorial land agent, asserting the Reed property had been improperly surveyed at its original claim and was therefore subject to reassessment, a tactic Ezra recognized immediately as another version of the same method, using confusion and paperwork to accomplish what open theft could not. But this time Sue Lynn was not facing it without knowledge or without allies. Ezra rode with her to the territorial land office himself, and the ranch hands who had worked the property for years gave sworn statements as to its boundaries, and the original survey, once located in the county archive, proved the claim exactly as it had always been. Pruitt's reassessment attempt collapsed under its own weight before a circuit judge who had little patience left for a banker's third attempt to relitigate a settled matter. Wallace Pruitt did not attend the hearing himself. He sent his lawyer instead, and the lawyer left the courthouse looking like a man who understood, even if his employer did not yet fully accept it, that Larkspur Hollow had just watched a widow and a rancher take apart a scheme that had worked on 4 other ranches without ever once being challenged aloud. 3 months passed after that, and the season turned from the dry heat of late summer into the sharper gold light of autumn, and the Reed Ranch, no longer under threat of seizure, began the slow work of proving what it could become under Sue Lynn's full and undisputed ownership. Ezra found himself riding over more often than the settling of one legal matter required. He told himself in the beginning that it was Copper who drew him back, the horse having taken to a routine of standing at the fence line whenever Ezra's own horse came into view from the road, an old habit from the years the two animals had been paddocked together as colts. But by the time the first frost silvered the grass in October, Ezra no longer bothered pretending, even to himself, that the horse was the whole of the reason. Sue Lynn had rebuilt the breeding operation her husband had begun, and rebuilt it with an eye for bloodlines that Ezra found, watching her work a young mare in the round pen one October afternoon, genuinely remarkable. She did not ask for his opinion often, but when she did, she listened to it, the way Nathaniel had once told him she listened to everything, fully, without the performance of listening that so many people substituted for the real thing. "You have not asked me why I keep coming back," Ezra said, one evening in late October, the two of them standing at the same fence line where Copper had first refused to pass through his gate. "I assumed it was the horse," Sue Lynn said, but there was something careful in the way she said it, an opening left deliberately unclosed. "It was at first," Ezra admitted. "It is not any longer, and I think you have known that for some weeks." Sue Lynn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the horse rather than on him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular honesty of someone who had already lost enough that she no longer had patience for saying things sideways. "I buried a husband 6 months ago, Ezra," she said. "I do not know how to want something new while that grief is still this close to the surface. I do not know if it is disloyal to him to want it." "I do not think Nathaniel would call it disloyal," Ezra said, and his own voice was not entirely steady saying it. "I think he would say it was exactly like him, to leave the world having built 2 things worth keeping alive, a ranch and a friendship, and to hope both of them found their way to each other once he was gone." Sue Lynn turned to look at him then, and whatever she found in his face seemed to settle something in her. Not resolve it entirely. Grief does not resolve on any single evening, but ease it enough that she reached out and rested her hand briefly against the top rail of the fence beside his, not quite touching, but close enough that the distance between them had plainly changed its meaning. "I am not ready to promise anything," she said, "but I am not opposed to finding out, slowly, what this is." "Slowly suits me," Ezra said. "I have spent 6 years proving I know how to wait." By the following spring, the 2 ranches had begun operating as one in all but name, sharing pasture and labor and the particular unspoken partnership of 2 people who had built something neither of them had expected to find again. Copper sired his first foal that April, a dark colt with his father's uneven gait smoothed out by better breeding, and Ezra stood at the fence with Sue Lynn to watch it take its first uncertain steps, and neither of them needed to say aloud what the moment meant. Wallace Pruitt's bank lost 3 more clients that spring, ranchers who had heard the story of the widow who read the statute aloud on the courthouse steps and decided a man who needed to trick grieving widows was not a man they wished to owe money to. He remained in Larkspur Hollow, remained pleasant, remained polite in the particular way that no longer fooled anyone in the county, and that, Ezra thought, was its own kind of justice, quieter than a courtroom verdict, but no less complete. The gate that had stood shut for 6 years never closed again, not the way it once had. It swung open most mornings now for ranch hands moving stock between the two properties, for Sue Lynn riding in with the easy competence Ezra had come to rely on, for a life that had found its way, against every expectation either of them had carried into that first strange morning, into something neither grief nor Wallace Pruitt's careful cruelty had been able to take from them. Ezra thought sometimes, watching the light go gold over the same mountains that had stood the same blue distance through 6 years of solitude, that Nathaniel Reed would have found the whole arrangement exactly, stubbornly funny, the kind of joke he would have told at Ezra's expense for the rest of both their lives. Ezra found he did not mind imagining it. Some kinds of grief, given enough seasons and enough honesty, turn into something closer to gratitude, and he had learned, standing at a gate that would not stay shut against the people who mattered, that this was as true on the frontier as it was anywhere else in the world. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.